The streets of Vienna were alight with Christmas cheer. Snowfall blanketed the cobblestone streets, muffling the bustling sounds of the holiday crowd. Garlands of twinkling lights strung from wrought-iron lampposts illuminated a sea of festive market stalls, each brimming with treats, ornaments, and warm drinks. A crisp chill hung in the air, laced with the comforting sense of roasted chestnuts and cinnamon. Among the lively crowd was Edward Hallcroft, a man of imposing stature and quiet demeanor. Edward, a successful financier in his mid-40s, moved through the throng with purpose. His tailored wool coat and polished leather boots cut a sharp figure amidst the bustling crowd of families and street performers. Edward was not there for leisure. Christmas markets were for the sentimental, and Edward had long since abandoned such frivolities. Tonight, he was merely passing through on his way to a business engagement at the luxurious Imperial Hotel. His stride was brisk as he glanced occasionally at his wristwatch, its gold face glinting under the market's lights. Time was of the essence, as it always was in his carefully scheduled world. But just as Edward was nearing the edge of the market, a small voice stopped him in his tracks. "Mister, would you like a cake? It's fresh." He turned to find a little girl, no older than 8 or 9, standing in front of him. Her cheeks were flushed red from the cold, and her tattered woolen coat was far too thin for the biting weather. She held up a small basket lined with a threadbare cloth, containing a few misshapen cakes. Each one looked handmade, their rough edges a testament to humble beginnings. Edward frowned slightly, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "What are you doing out here alone at this hour?" he asked, his voice as crisp as the winter air. The girl hesitated, her fingers tightening around the handle of her basket. "I'm selling cakes, sir. Just a penny each," she said, her voice trembling slightly but full of determination. "It's for my family." Her rehearsed line didn't escape Edward's notice. He studied her for a moment longer, his analytical mind quick to assess her small, shivering frame, her patched clothes, and the trembling hope in her gaze. He had seen desperation before, though usually in boardrooms and courtrooms, not on the frost-bitten face of a child. "I don't carry coins," Edward said curtly, turning to leave. "Please, sir," the girl called after him, her voice breaking just enough to pierce through his resolve. "It's Christmas Eve. Just one cake. Please." Something in her tone, an odd mixture of innocence and despair, made Edward pause. He sighed, pulling out his wallet and offering her a banknote. "Here," he said, handing her far more than the cost of all the cakes combined. The girl's eyes widened, her small hand brushing against his gloved one as she took the note. "Thank you, sir. God bless you," she exclaimed, her voice filled with a gratitude so raw that it caught Edward off guard. But before he could respond, she did something entirely unexpected. The girl reached into her basket and picked out the least misshapen cake, carefully wrapped it in a scrap of wax paper, and held it out to him. "Here, sir. This one's the best," she said earnestly. Edward stared at the offering, unaccustomed to such gestures. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, almost mechanically, he took the cake, nodding once in acknowledgement. The girl beamed, her face lighting up in a way that made the festive market lights seem dull in comparison. "Thank you, mister," she said again, before darting off into the crowd. Edward watched her small figure disappear, his gloved fingers tightening around the cake she had insisted he take. Something about the encounter left him unsettled, a sensation he couldn't quite name. Shaking his head, he tucked the cake into his coat pocket and resumed his walk to the hotel. As Edward stepped into the grandeur of the Imperial Hotel lobby, the warmth and opulence of his surroundings did little to quell the nagging feeling that followed him. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the murmur of Vienna's elite filled the space. A waiter approached, offering champagne, but Edward waved him away. He was here to close a lucrative deal with a foreign investor, not to mingle. But even as he settled into the leather chair of a private meeting room, the image of the little girl lingered in his mind. Her pale face, her trembling hands, her wide, hopeful eyes, they all gnawed at the edges of his usually impenetrable focus. "Edward!" A voice broke through his thoughts. It was Peter Lang, his business partner, looking at him quizzically. "Are you all right? You seem distracted." Edward straightened, his professional mask snapping back into place. "I'm fine," he said briskly. "Let's get to it." The meeting began, but Edward's thoughts remained elsewhere. Hours later, as he prepared to leave, he absent-mindedly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the cake. It was slightly crushed, but still intact. He stared at it for a long moment, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar ache. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily, and the streets had emptied. Edward stepped out into the cold night, the warmth of the hotel quickly forgotten. As he walked back towards his townhouse, he passed by the now deserted market. The festive stalls were closed, their wares packed away, but the memory of the little girl remained vivid. Where had she gone? Why had she been out there alone on Christmas Eve? Edward shook his head, irritated by his own lingering thoughts. Yet, deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning of a story he couldn't walk away from. Edward Hallcroft awoke to the soft glow of winter sunlight filtering through his bedroom windows. Snow continued to fall, layering Vienna in a pristine blanket of white. The memory of the little girl from the market returned unbidden as he sipped his morning coffee, her wide, hopeful eyes lingering in his thoughts. It was unusual for Edward to dwell on such encounters. His life was built around precision and logic, numbers, deals, and cold, calculated decisions. But as he stared out over the snow-covered city from his study window, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the girl's story than met the eye. "Ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. Yet, the cake she had given him remained on his desk, a small but insistent reminder of their brief meeting. Later that morning, Edward ventured out into the city. Though Christmas Day had begun, the streets were already alive with families and couples enjoying the holiday spirit. He found himself drawn back to the market, now devoid of its bustling crowds and vibrant stalls. The festive decorations still hung in place, but the space felt eerily quiet. He scanned the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of the girl, though he wasn't entirely sure why. She was gone, of course, likely returned to whatever corner of the city she called home. Still, Edward's instincts told him to dig deeper. He approached an older woman sweeping the cobblestones near one of the shuttered stalls. "Excuse me," he began, his authoritative voice drawing her attention. "I'm looking for a young girl. She was here last night selling cakes, about 8 or 9 years old, dark hair, wearing a worn coat." The woman paused, leaning on her broom as she regarded him warily. "You're not the first to ask about her," she said, her Viennese accent thick. Edward's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The woman sighed, glancing over her shoulder as if checking for unseen observers. "The girl, her name's Anya. She's here most evenings, selling her cakes. Sweet little thing, but her life, it's not an easy one." Edward leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Go on." The woman hesitated, then continued, her voice tinged with pity. "She lives with her uncle, a cruel man if you ask me. Sends her out in the cold to sell those cakes while he drinks away whatever money she earns. I've seen her with bruises before, but she never complains, just smiles and does what she's told." A cold anger flared in Edward's chest, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Where can I find this uncle?" The woman shook her head. "I don't know exactly. Somewhere near the docks, I think. But you'd best be careful. Men like him don't take kindly to strangers asking questions." Edward nodded, slipping a folded bill into her hand as thanks before turning away. The image of Anya, cold, trembling, and alone, was sharper now, more vivid. He couldn't ignore it. By the docks, Edward arrived at the docks as dusk settled over the city. The area was a stark contrast to the elegant streets he usually frequented. Narrow alleys wound between dilapidated buildings, and the air smelled of salt and decay. It didn't take long to find signs of life. A small group of children huddled around a barrel fire, their faces hollow and pale. Edward approached cautiously, his polished boots crunching against the icy ground. "Do you know a girl named Anya?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The children exchanged wary glances. Finally, a boy no older than 10 spoke up. "Who's asking?" Edward reached into his coat and pulled out a few coins, holding them in his gloved hand. "Just a concerned gentleman." The boy snatched the coins, stuffing them into his pocket. "She lives over there," he said, pointing toward a crumbling tenement building at the edge of the docks. "With her uncle. But you won't like what you find." Edward's jaw tightened as he followed the boy's direction. The building loomed before him, its windows dark and broken. The faint sound of shouting echoed from within. Inside the tenement, the interior of the building was worse than Edward had imagined. The air was damp and smelled of mildew. Cracked walls and creaking floors made every step a challenge. He climbed the narrow staircase, the sound of his footsteps muted by the muffling snow outside. On the 3rd floor, he stopped in front of a door where the shouting was loudest. The voice was slurred and angry, punctuated by the crash of something breaking. Edward didn't hesitate. He knocked firmly on the door. The noise inside ceased abruptly. After a moment, the door swung open, revealing a disheveled man with bloodshot eyes. He reeked of alcohol and looked at Edward with suspicion. "Who the hell are you?" the man growled. "I'm here to see Anya," Edward said evenly. The man's eyes narrowed. "She's not here. Now get lost." Before Edward could respond, a small voice called out from behind the man. "I'm here." Anya appeared in the doorway, her small frame dwarfed by the man's bulk. Her face was pale, and there was a fresh bruise on her cheek. She looked at Edward with a mixture of recognition and fear. "Go back inside," the man barked, but Edward stepped forward. "I don't think so," he said coldly. "Anya, come with me." The man laughed bitterly, leaning against the doorframe. "You're not taking her anywhere. She's mine, and if you think you can just walk in here and—" Edward cut him off. "How much?" The man blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "How much for the girl?" Edward repeated, his voice like ice. For a moment, the man seemed unsure whether to laugh or lash out. But then greed flickered in his eyes. 500, he said, crossing his arms. Euros. Edward didn't flinch. He pulled out his wallet, counted the money, and handed it over without a word. The man snatched it, stuffing it into his pocket with a sneer. "She's yours," he said, stepping aside. Edward knelt down to Anya's level, his voice softening. "It's all right now. You're coming with me." Anya hesitated, glancing back at the man. He glared at her but said nothing. Finally, she took Edward's outstretched hand, her small fingers trembling against his. A new beginning. As they stepped out into the snowy night, Edward felt a strange sense of relief. Anya stayed close to him, clutching her empty basket as if it were a lifeline. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Where are we going?" Edward paused. He hadn't thought that far ahead. But as he looked at the child beside him, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't abandon her. "To someplace better," he said finally. "Someplace where you'll never have to sell cakes in the cold again." The drive back to Edward Hallcroft's townhouse was silent, the weight of the night settling over both him and Anya. Snow fell steadily, softening the harsh edges of the world outside. Edward glanced at the girl beside him, her small frame dwarfed by the plush leather seat. She clutched her empty basket as though it were a shield, her eyes fixed on the passing lights of the city. "Are you warm enough?" Edward asked, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. Anya nodded, but didn't look at him. He noticed her shoulders trembling despite the car's heater. He removed his scarf and handed it to her. She hesitated before taking it, wrapping it tightly around her neck. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Edward's jaw tightened. For all his wealth and influence, he had never felt so powerless. The bruises on her cheek, the fear in her eyes, these were things no child should endure. An unexpected bond. When they arrived at Edward's townhouse, Anya hesitated at the doorstep, her wide eyes taking in the grandeur of the building. The ornate iron gates, the polished stone steps, and the towering facade seemed to overwhelm her. "Come on," Edward said, offering her a reassuring nod. Inside, the warmth of the home wrapped around them like a protective cocoon. The marble floors gleamed, and a towering Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, its golden lights casting a soft glow. Edward rarely bothered with decorations, but his housekeeper had insisted this year. Now, for the first time, he was glad she had. "Make yourself comfortable," Edward said, gesturing to the sofa. Anya perched on the edge of the cushion, her basket still clutched tightly. She looked out of place against the backdrop of luxury, her worn clothes and wary demeanor stark contrasts to the elegance around her. A housekeeper appeared from the kitchen, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she noticed the child. "Mr. Holcroft," she began cautiously. "It's all right, Clara," Edward said quickly. "This is Anya. She'll be staying with us for now. Could you prepare something warm for her to eat?" Clara nodded, her maternal instincts kicking in as she disappeared into the kitchen. Edward sat across from Anya, his gaze steady. "You're safe here," he said. "No one will hurt you anymore." Anya finally looked up at him, her eyes wary but searching. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Edward hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He wasn't sure himself. Perhaps it was guilt. Guilt for having lived a life so detached from the struggles of others. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a nagging sense that he was meant to cross paths with this child. "Because you shouldn't have to face the things you've faced," he said simply. Anya nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. The first night. After dinner, Clara prepared a guest room for Anya. The room was cozy, with a small bed, warm blankets, and a window overlooking the snowy garden. Anya stood in the doorway, clutching her basket. "This is for me?" she asked, disbelief coloring her tone. Edward smiled faintly. "Yes, for as long as you need it." She stepped inside tentatively, running her fingers along the edge of the bed. "I've never had my own room before," she whispered. Edward's chest tightened at her words. He nodded, watching as she sat on the bed, her small figure swallowed by the blankets. "Good night, Anya," he said softly, turning to leave. "Good night, Mr. Holcroft," she replied, her voice small but steady. Questions without answers. Edward couldn't sleep that night. He sat in his study, staring at the faint glow of the fire as his mind raced. He had made a bold decision taking Anya in, and now he was beginning to feel the weight of it. There were so many unanswered questions. Who was this uncle who had sold her so easily? Where were her parents? What other horrors had she endured? The thought of hiring private investigators crossed his mind. He knew people who could uncover the truth, but something about Anya's fragility made him hesitate. Would she trust him enough to share her story? Or would pushing too hard drive her away? He glanced at the small cake still sitting on his desk. It was a reminder of how little she had, yet she had given it to him so willingly. The gesture spoke of resilience, kindness, and hope, qualities Edward had long forgotten in his own life. Asdaker, a glimpse of the truth. The next morning, Edward found Anya in the kitchen with Clara. The girl was eating a warm bowl of porridge, her cheeks pink from the heat. "Good morning," Edward greeted, his tone lighter than usual. Anya looked up, a tentative smile forming. Good morning, Mr. Holcroft. Edward, he corrected gently. You can call me Edward. She nodded, though the name felt foreign on her tongue. After breakfast, Edward sat with Anya in the living room. He approached the subject delicately, not wanting to overwhelm her. Anya, I want to help you, but I need to understand more about your situation. Can you tell me about your family? Anya's expression darkened, and she looked away, clutching her basket. I don't have a family, she said softly. Edward frowned. What about your parents? My mama. She died last year, Anya whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Papa left before that. I don't even remember him. Edward's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her words. And your uncle? He pressed gently. He's not really my uncle, Anya admitted, her voice trembling. He found me on the streets after Mama died, said he'd take care of me, but all he did was make me work. If I didn't sell enough, he'd… Her voice broke, and she stopped, unable to continue. Edward leaned forward, his expression fierce but calm. You don't have to go back to him. Ever. Do you understand? Anya nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. A new plan. That evening, Edward made a decision. He would protect Anya at all costs, but he couldn't do it alone. He reached out to his lawyer, his private investigator, and a trusted friend who worked in child welfare. Find out everything you can about this so-called uncle, Edward instructed the investigator, and make sure he can't harm her or anyone else again. He knew the road ahead would be complicated, but as he watched Anya playing quietly with a set of old chess pieces in the living room, he felt a newfound sense of purpose. For the first time in years, Edward Holcroft wasn't thinking about profits, deals, or prestige. His focus was on something, or rather, someone, far more important. Snow fell steadily over Vienna, blanketing the city in a serene white hush. Edward Holcroft sat in his study, the warmth of the crackling fireplace contrasting sharply with the icy wind outside. In front of him lay a folder containing the initial findings from his private investigator. He opened it with a steady hand, though a storm of emotions churned within him. The report was thorough but chilling. Anya's uncle wasn't her uncle at all, as she had admitted. His name was Victor Polzin, a small-time criminal known for exploiting vulnerable children. Victor had been arrested once for trafficking counterfeit goods, but had avoided serious prison time due to lack of evidence. The investigator's notes detailed a network of people like Victor, men and women, who preyed on the homeless and orphaned, forcing them to beg or sell goods under the guise of help. Edward's jaw tightened as he read on. The most damning revelation was the confirmation that Victor had taken Anya in shortly after her mother's death, exploiting her grief and desperation. Beneath the cold facts of the report, Edward felt a growing anger. He set the folder down, running a hand through his hair. Victor wasn't just a problem to be dealt with. He was a threat that needed to be eliminated, not just for Anya's sake, but for every child who might fall into his grasp. A morning conversation. The next morning, Edward found Anya sitting by the window in the living room, her face pressed against the glass as she watched the snow fall. She looked peaceful, a soft smile playing on her lips, but Edward knew the weight of her past still lingered. "Good morning," he greeted, his voice warm. Anya turned, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Good morning, Edward." He gestured to the seat opposite her. "May I join you?" She nodded, tucking her feet under her as he sat down. "I've been thinking about what you told me," Edward began, keeping his tone gentle. "About Victor." Anya's expression darkened slightly, and she looked away. "I want you to know," Edward continued, "that you don't have to worry about him anymore. He won't hurt you again." Anya's eyes flicked back to his, uncertain but hopeful. "How can you be sure?" "Because I'm going to make sure of it," Edward said firmly. Anya hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. "You're safe here, Anya. I promise you." Searching for joy. Over the next few days, Edward made a conscious effort to bring some light into Anya's life. He wasn't a man accustomed to parenting, but he found himself surprisingly willing to learn. One afternoon, he took her to a toy shop where her eyes widened at the shelves filled with dolls, puzzles, and games. At first, she hesitated to pick anything, overwhelmed by the abundance. "Choose whatever you like," Edward encouraged gently. After much deliberation, she selected a simple wooden puzzle and a stuffed bear with a red scarf. Edward added a chess set to the pile, noticing how much she had enjoyed playing with his old pieces back at the house. On another day, they visited a nearby park where children were sledding down snow-covered hills. Anya watched them with a wistful look, and Edward immediately made arrangements to buy a sled. By the end of the afternoon, Anya's laughter rang out across the park as she sped down the hills, her cheeks flushed with joy. For Edward, these moments were transformative. He began to see the world through Anya's eyes, finding wonder in the simplest things, from the sparkle of icicles on tree branches to the joy of warm cocoa after a day in the snow. The shadow of Victor. But as the days passed, Edward couldn't shake the looming presence of Victor. The investigator had uncovered Victor's current whereabouts, a decrepit building on the outskirts of the city. He was still active, still preying on children like Anya. Edward knew he couldn't simply move on while Victor remained a threat. He began making calls, using his influence to involve law enforcement. However, the process was slow, and Edward's frustration grew with each passing day. One evening, as Edward sat in his study, his phone buzzed with a message from the investigator. "Victor spotted at St. Mark's Square, meeting someone. Could be significant." Edward stood, his heart pounding. He considered calling the authorities, but decided against it. The law was often too slow to act, and he couldn't risk Victor slipping away. Instead, he grabbed his coat and headed out into the snowy night. Oh! A confrontation in the square. St. Mark's Square was eerily quiet, the festive lights casting long shadows across the snow. Edward spotted Victor near a fountain, speaking with a wiry man in a tattered coat. He moved closer, staying within the shadows. The conversation was low, but Edward caught snippets: money, children, and roots. His anger boiled over. Victor wasn't just exploiting Anya, he was part of a much larger operation. Edward stepped forward, his footsteps crunching on the snow. Victor turned, his eyes narrowing when he recognized Edward. "Well, well," Victor sneered. "If it isn't the Good Samaritan, here to lecture me again?" Edward's voice was cold. "I'm here to make sure you never harm another child." Victor laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "And how do you plan to do that, rich boy? You don't scare me." Edward took another step forward, his composure unshaken. "You should be scared. I have connections, resources, everything I need to make your life a living hell." Victor's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it with bravado. "You think you're untouchable? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Edward's expression darkened. "Neither do you." The tension crackled in the icy air, but before the situation could escalate, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Edward turned to see two police officers walking toward them, their badges gleaming in the light. "Mr. Hallcroft," one of them said, nodding, "we received your report. We'll take it from here." Victor's bravado crumbled as the officers closed in. He glared at Edward, venom in his eyes. "This isn't over," he hissed as they cuffed him. Edward watched silently as Victor was led away, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. Returning home. When Edward returned home that night, Anya was waiting for him in the living room, her stuffed bear clutched tightly. "Where did you go?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. "I had to take care of something," Edward said, kneeling beside her. "But it's done now. You don't have to worry about Victor anymore." Anya's eyes searched his face, and when she saw the truth in his expression, her shoulders relaxed. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Edward placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now, Anya. I promise." For the first time since they'd met, she leaned forward and hugged him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Edward held her gently, a wave of unfamiliar but welcome warmth washing over him. In that moment, he realized how much this little girl had already changed him, and how far he was willing to go to ensure her happiness. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the frosted windows of Edward Hallcroft's townhouse, painting the living room with a golden glow. It had been a week since Victor's arrest, and life had begun to settle into a tentative rhythm. Anya's laughter now filled the once quiet home, and Edward found himself adapting to his new role as her guardian, a role he had never expected but had embraced wholeheartedly. Baki, a home for Anya. One morning, Edward sat across from Anya at the breakfast table. Clara, the housekeeper, bustled about, setting down steaming plates of eggs and toast. Anya had taken to calling her Aunt Clara, a title the older woman bore with pride. "You've been here a little while now," Edward began, his tone measured. "How are you feeling, Anya?" She looked up from her plate, her dark eyes thoughtful. "It feels safe," she said slowly, as if testing the words. "I like it here." Edward smiled. "Good, because I want you to feel at home. This is your home now, Anya." Her gaze softened, but a flicker of doubt remained. "What if they make me leave?" she whispered. "No one will make you leave," Edward said firmly. "You have my word." Anya nodded, a small smile breaking through. New beginnings. Determined to give Anya a sense of normalcy, Edward began arranging for her education. He contacted a local private school with a reputation for nurturing children from diverse backgrounds. At first, Anya balked at the idea of attending school. "What if I can't keep up?" she asked one evening, her voice laced with anxiety. Edward knelt beside her, his expression earnest. "You're smart, Anya. I've seen it. And school isn't just about learning from books. It's about making friends and having a place where you belong." She considered his words, then nodded hesitantly. "Okay, I'll try." The first day of school was nerve-wracking for both of them. Edward walked Anya to the gates, her small hand clutching his tightly. She wore a new coat and carried a backpack he'd chosen with care, but she still looked impossibly small against the backdrop of the towering school building. "You'll do great," Edward assured her, kneeling to meet her eye level. "I'll be right here to pick you up after." Anya bit her lip, then nodded. Then, "Promise?" "Promise," Edward said, squeezing her hand. As she walked through the gates, Edward felt a pang of pride mixed with protectiveness. Watching her take those first steps into a new world reminded him just how far she had come, and how far they still had to go. Also, Freddy, a ghost from the past. Later that week, Edward received an unexpected phone call. It was from the investigator he'd hired to look into Victor. "We've found something you should know," the investigator said, his tone grave. "It's about Anya's father." Edward sat up straight, his heart pounding. "Her father? I thought he abandoned them years ago." "That's what everyone assumed," the investigator replied. "But we've discovered that he may not have left willingly. There are records of a man matching his description being involved in a labor scheme, forced work under dangerous conditions. It's possible he was coerced or trapped." Edward's mind raced. The idea that Anya's father might still be alive and in peril filled him with a sense of urgency. "Where is he now?" Edward asked. "We're still piecing that together," the investigator admitted, "but I thought you'd want to know." Edward thanked him and ended the call, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions. Should he tell Anya? Or would giving her hope only lead to heartbreak? Bakaskonjordan, the fragile heart. That evening, Edward found Anya in the library, engrossed in a picture book Clara had brought home. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up. "Edward," she exclaimed, "did you know there are birds that live in the snow? They're so small, but they survive anyway." He smiled, sitting beside her. "I did know that. They're called snow buntings, resilient little creatures." Anya nodded enthusiastically. "I want to be like them." Edward hesitated, the investigator's words weighing on him. "Anya, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, closing her book. "What do you remember about your father?" he asked gently. Her expression turned pensive. "Not much," she admitted. "Mama didn't talk about him a lot. She said he loved us, but he couldn't stay." Edward reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. "If he were still out there, would you want to find him?" Anya's eyes widened. "Do you think he's alive?" "I don't know," Edward said honestly, "but I think it's worth finding out." For a moment, Anya was silent, her small hands clutching the edges of the book. Then she nodded. "Yes, I'd want to know." Uncovering the truth, over the next few days, Edward threw himself into the search for Anya's father. He hired additional investigators and leveraged his network to follow every lead. Meanwhile, he kept Anya informed, careful to manage her expectations. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room, Edward shared the latest update. "They've tracked him to a factory in Romania," he said. "It's not confirmed yet, but they're following the lead." Anya's face lit up with cautious hope. "Do you think he's okay?" Edward hesitated. "I don't know, Anya, but whatever happens, we'll face it together." A new threat. Just as Edward began to feel they were making progress, an unsettling development arose. Victor, though jailed, was attempting to manipulate the legal system to secure his release. Worse, there were whispers that he still had connections willing to do his bidding. Edward tightened security around his home, hiring additional staff to ensure Anya's safety. He also met with his legal team, determined to ensure that Victor's influence wouldn't endanger her. But despite his efforts, the threat loomed large, casting a shadow over their newfound stability. A growing bond. Amid the chaos, Edward and Anya's bond deepened. She began to trust him fully, confiding in him about her fears, her dreams, and the scars Victor had left behind. Edward, in turn, found himself transformed by her resilience and spirit. One evening, as they played a game of chess by the fire, Anya looked up at him suddenly. "Edward?" she asked. "Yes, Anya? Do you think families are chosen?" He considered her question carefully. "I think sometimes the people who come into our lives are more important than the ones we're born to. Family is about love and trust, not just blood." Anya smiled softly. "Then I think you're my family." Edward's heart swelled at her words. "And you're mine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The icy winds of January swept through Vienna, but inside Edward Hallcroft's townhouse, the atmosphere was warm and alive. Anya, bundled in a sweater and clutching her ever-present stuffed bear, was sitting cross-legged on the floor, working on a jigsaw puzzle. Edward watched her from the doorway, a sense of peace settling over him. It had been a month since Victor's arrest, and though there were lingering shadows, Anya's transformation was undeniable. Her laughter came more easily now, and the dark circles under her eyes had faded. Yet Edward knew the search for her father was a thread still hanging loose, one that might change everything. The investigator's news. One frosty morning, Edward received a call from his investigator. "We've confirmed it," the man said. "Anya's father is alive. His name is Pyotr Leskov, and he's working at a textile factory near Bucharest, Romania." Edward's breath caught. "Is he safe?" "Safe enough," the investigator replied, his tone cautious. But his situation isn't ideal. The factory employs workers in questionable conditions. It's not a place anyone stays by choice. Does he know about Anya? We haven't approached him yet. We thought it best to inform you first. Edward nodded, a wave of mixed emotions crashing over him. Relief that Piotr was alive, anxiety over what the reunion might bring. Telling Anya. That evening, Edward sat with Anya in the living room, the fire crackling softly beside them. She was reading a storybook, her feet tucked under her, when Edward gently interrupted. Anya, he began, his voice measured. I have news about your father. Her book slipped from her hands as she looked up at him, her eyes wide. You found him? Edward nodded. He's alive. He's in Romania, working at a factory. Tears welled in Anya's eyes, though her expression was hard to read. Is he coming here? She asked, her voice trembling. Edward leaned forward, taking her small hands in his. That depends. If you'd like, we can go to him and see if he's ready to reconnect. It's your choice, Anya. There's no rush. She looked down at her hands, her fingers curling around Edward's. I want to see him, she said softly. But what if he doesn't want me? Edward's heart clenched at her vulnerability. Anya, I can't promise how he'll feel, but I'll be with you every step of the way. You're not alone in this. She nodded, her tears spilling over. Thank you, Edward. The journey to Romania. 2 days later, Edward and Anya boarded a plane to Bucharest. Anya was quiet throughout the journey, staring out the window as the clouds rolled by. Edward watched her carefully, giving her space but offering quiet reassurances when she needed them. Upon arriving, they met with the investigator, who briefed them on the factory. It's a rough place, he warned. Piotr works long hours, and the conditions are poor. He stays in a dormitory nearby. Edward's jaw tightened. We'll go to him directly. The reunion. The factory loomed ahead, a sprawling, grimy complex surrounded by snow-covered fields. The air was thick with the smell of oil and smoke. Edward held Anya's hand tightly as they approached, her steps slowing as they neared the entrance. Inside, the dimly lit space was filled with the hum of sewing machines and the sight of workers hunched over their tasks. The investigator guided them to a foreman, who nodded toward a man at the far end of the room. There, Pyotr Leskov. Edward's eyes followed the direction, landing on a tall, wiry man with graying hair. His shoulders were slumped with exhaustion, his hands moving methodically over the fabric in front of him. Anya's grip on Edward's hand tightened. That's him? She whispered. Yes, Edward said gently. Are you ready? Anya hesitated, then nodded. They approached slowly. When they were close enough, Edward spoke. Pyotr Leskov? The man looked up, his brow furrowing. His eyes landed on Anya, and for a moment, he froze. Who? He began, his voice hoarse. Anya stepped forward, her voice trembling. Papa? Pyotr's eyes widened, and he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Anya, he whispered, his voice breaking. Anya nodded, tears streaming down her face. Pyotr dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached for her. My Anya, I thought I'd lost you. She threw her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. Pyotr held her tightly, his own tears falling freely. Edward stood back, his chest tight as he watched the reunion unfold. Questions and answers. Later, in a small cafe near the factory, Pyotr shared his story. After Anya's mother had fallen ill, he had sought work to support them. He had been lured to Romania by promises of fair wages, only to find himself trapped in exploitative conditions. I sent letters, Pyotr said, his voice heavy with regret, but I never heard back. When I finally saved enough to return, I learned she had died, and Anya was gone. I thought I'd lost everything. Anya clung to his arm, her eyes shining with emotion. "I thought you left us," she said softly. Piotr shook his head fiercely. "Never. I would never leave you by choice." Edward cleared his throat, his voice steady. "You don't have to stay here anymore. If you're willing, I'll help you start fresh in Vienna." Piotr looked at him with gratitude and hesitation. "Why would you do this for us?" Edward glanced at Anya, her small hand resting in her father's. "Because family deserves a second chance, and because Anya is worth it." A fragile balance. The journey back to Vienna was filled with tentative hope. Piotr marveled at the life Edward had given Anya, his gratitude evident. Yet Edward sensed the unspoken tension, Piotr's guilt for the time he had lost, Anya's uncertainty about rebuilding their bond. Edward remained patient, giving them space to navigate their new reality. He offered Piotr a room in the townhouse and began helping him secure honest work in Vienna. One evening, Edward found Piotr in the library, staring at the chessboard Anya loved so much. "You've given her a life I couldn't," Piotr said, his voice heavy with emotion. "How can I repay you?" Edward sat across from him. "By being the father she needs now. The past can't be undone, but the future is still ours to shape." Piotr nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. The days following Piotr's arrival in Vienna were filled with tentative steps toward rebuilding. Edward watched with cautious optimism as Anya and her father reconnected. Their bond, though fragile, was undeniable. Anya began sharing small details of her life with Piotr, stories of her time with Edward, her love for puzzles, and her newfound interest in chess. Piotr, for his part, was eager to make up for lost time. He took Edward's advice and secured a modest job at a local carpentry workshop. Though the pay was meager, the work brought him a sense of purpose. Each evening, he returned home with tired hands, but a heart lightened by the sight of his daughter waiting for him. A quiet threat. Despite the growing harmony in the household, Edward couldn't shake a sense of unease. Victor's arrest had been a victory, but the man's connections ran deep. Edward's investigators had warned him that Victor was attempting to manipulate the legal system to secure his release. One evening, as Edward reviewed his correspondence, Clara entered the study, her face pale. "Mr. Hallcroft," she began, her voice trembling. "There's a man outside. He says he has a message for you." Edward frowned. "What kind of message?" "He wouldn't say. He insisted you speak with him directly." Edward stood, his instincts immediately on edge. He stepped out onto the townhouse's front steps, where a wiry man in a shabby coat waited, shuffling nervously. "Who are you?" Edward demanded. The man avoided his gaze. "I'm just the messenger," he muttered, handing Edward a folded piece of paper. "Victor says to read it, that's all." Edward unfolded the note, his jaw tightening as he read the words. "You think you've won? But I'm not done yet. Watch your back. And hers." Preparing for the worst, Edward's mind raced as he returned inside. He couldn't ignore the threat. Victor's network might still be active, and Edward knew that protecting Anya and Piotr had to be his top priority. That night, after Anya had gone to bed, Edward called Piotr into the study. He showed him the note, his expression grave. "This is serious," Edward said. "We need to be vigilant." Piotr's face darkened as he read the note. "If he comes near Anya—" "He won't," Edward interrupted, his voice firm. "I've increased security around the house, and I've alerted the authorities. But I need you to be careful, Piotr. If Victor has people watching, we can't afford to take risks." Piotr nodded, determination hardening his features. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe." A fractured peace. Despite Edward's precautions, the tension in the household was palpable. Anya, ever perceptive, began to notice the guarded looks and hushed conversations. One afternoon, she confronted Edward as he sat in the library. "Edward," she said softly, "is something wrong?" Edward hesitated, weighing how much to tell her. Finally, he sighed. "There's a chance Victor might try to cause trouble, but I promise you, Anya, you're safe here. We won't let anything happen to you." Anya's brow furrowed, her small hands clutching the edges of her stuffed bear. "What about Papa?" she asked. "Will he be safe too?" Edward leaned forward, his voice steady. "Yes, Anya. We'll protect him too. We're a family now, and families stick together." Anya nodded, though the worry in her eyes remained. The unseen enemy. The weeks that followed were marked by a tense calm. Edward's security team reported no unusual activity, and Victor remained in custody as his appeals stalled in court. Slowly, the household began to relax. One evening, as Edward and Piotr played a quiet game of chess, there was a sudden knock at the door. Clara answered it, her voice muffled as she spoke with someone outside. Moments later, she entered the living room, her expression uneasy. "There's a police officer here to see you, Mr. Holcroft," she said. Edward exchanged a glance with Piotr before rising to meet the officer. The man was tall and somber, his uniform dusted with snow. "I'm afraid I have some troubling news," the officer said. "We've received reports that Victor Polzin may have bribed his way out of custody. He hasn't been seen since yesterday." Edward's heart sank. "What steps are being taken to find him?" "We've issued a warrant and alerted our networks," the officer replied. "But given his connections, he could be anywhere." A dangerous encounter. The following evening, Edward was returning home from a meeting when his car was forced to stop abruptly in a quiet side street. A van had parked diagonally across the road, blocking the way. Edward's driver frowned, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Should I turn around, sir?" Before Edward could respond, the van's side door slid open, and two men stepped out. One of them was Victor. Edward's stomach twisted, but he kept his composure as Victor approached the car. "Step out, Holcroft," Victor growled. Edward opened the door, stepping out onto the snow-dusted pavement. He faced Victor calmly, though his pulse raced. "What do you want?" Edward asked coldly. "You took something from me," Victor snarled. "The girl, her father. You think you can just walk into my life and destroy everything?" "I didn't destroy anything," Edward said evenly. "You did that yourself. Anya and Piotr are free from you now. Let it go." Victor's face twisted with rage. "You think this is over? It's not. I'll make you regret crossing me." Edward held his ground, his voice steady. "If you come near Anya or her father again, I will destroy whatever's left of your life." "That's not a threat, Victor. It's a promise." The tension crackled in the cold air. For a moment, Victor looked as though he might lunge at Edward, but then he stepped back, spitting on the ground. "This isn't over," he said, retreating to the van. As the vehicle sped away, Edward exhaled slowly, his hands clenched into fists. The family gathers. When Edward returned home, he immediately called Piotr into the study and recounted the encounter. Piotr's face darkened, his fists tightening. "We can't let him hurt her," Piotr said fiercely. "He won't," Edward assured him. "I've already contacted additional security. We'll make sure Victor doesn't come close." Later that night, Edward found Anya asleep in her room, her stuffed bear clutched tightly. He stood in the doorway, his resolve hardening. Whatever it took, he would protect her. The next morning, the household awoke under a tense cloud. Edward had spent the night strategizing with his security team, ensuring every precaution was in place. He contacted the local authorities and his legal advisors, pushing for every avenue to have Victor's escape formally addressed. Anya, perceptive as ever, noticed the heightened security, the new faces patrolling the grounds, the subtle tension in Edward's voice. When she asked about it, Edward knelt beside her and chose honesty. "Victor may try to come back," he said softly. But we won't let him hurt you or your father. I promise." Anya's eyes flickered with fear, but also trust. She nodded, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. "I know you'll keep us safe." A quiet day disrupted. The day passed uneventfully. Edward worked in his study, while Pyotr and Anya spent time in the library, where Anya taught her father the basics of chess. Edward occasionally glanced out the window, scanning the snowy streets for anything unusual. The peace shattered just after sunset. Clara burst into the study, her face pale. "Mr. Hallcroft," she gasped, "the security team spotted someone near the garden fence. They think it might be Victor." Edward shot to his feet, his heart pounding. "Where's Anya?" "With Pyotr in the library," Clara said. "Stay with them," Edward instructed. He grabbed his coat and stepped into the hallway, signaling to his head of security. "You, sir?" The standoff outside, the air was bitterly cold. Edward's breath fogged in front of him as he approached the garden fence. Two security guards flanked him, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Near the edge of the property, a figure stood partially hidden by the shadows of a tree. It was Victor. Edward stepped forward, his voice steady. "You've made a mistake coming here." Victor chuckled darkly, stepping into the light. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild with desperation. "Mistake? No, Hallcroft. The mistake was thinking you could take everything from me without consequences." Edward raised a hand, signaling his guards to hold back. "You're outnumbered and out of options. Walk away while you still can." Victor's gaze flickered to the house, his voice laced with venom. "This isn't just about revenge. It's about showing you that money and power can't fix everything. People like you think you can control the world, but you can't control me." "I don't need to control you," Edward said coldly. "I just need to ensure you never hurt anyone again." As Edward spoke, a flash of movement caught his eye. He turned just in time to see one of Victor's accomplices darting toward the house. Anya's courage. Inside, Anya and Pyotr were in the library, the sound of raised voices outside reaching their ears. Pyotr moved toward the door, his instincts sharp. "Stay here," he told Anya firmly. But Anya had already sensed the danger. As Pyotr opened the door, a man burst into the room, his face obscured by a scarf. He lunged toward Pyotr, shoving him aside and advancing on Anya. Anya froze for a moment, fear gripping her. But then, as the man reached for her, something shifted. She grabbed the chessboard from the table and swung it with all her strength, striking the man across the arm. The intruder recoiled, cursing, as Pyotr tackled him to the ground. The commotion drew the attention of the security guards, who rushed into the room and subdued the man. Anya, trembling but unharmed, ran to her father. "Papa, are you okay?" Pyotr hugged her tightly, his voice steady despite his shaking hands. "I'm fine, my brave girl. You were incredible." The final confrontation. Outside, Edward's guards had detained Victor and his remaining accomplices. Victor struggled against them, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't over," he snarled as the police arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the snowy street. Edward stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Yes, it is. You won't get another chance to hurt her, or anyone else." The officers cuffed Victor, dragging him to their waiting car. Edward watched until they drove away, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. A new chapter. The aftermath of the night's events brought a mix of relief and reflection. Anya's courage had stunned both Edward and Pyotr, and her actions had played a critical role in ensuring their safety. That evening, as they gathered in the living room, Edward addressed Anya directly. "You were incredibly brave today," he said, "but you shouldn't have had to face that." Anya looked up at him, her eyes shining with determination. "You told me I'm part of this family. Families protect each other, right?" Edward smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's right." Pyotr placed a hand on her shoulder. And I'm so proud of you, Anya. But from now on, we'll make sure you don't have to face danger like that again. Forged in fire. The days that followed were a turning point for their small family. Piotr, emboldened by the events, took steps to solidify his new life in Vienna, while Edward finalized the adoption process to ensure Anya's future was secure. One snowy evening, as they sat by the fire, Anya looked at Edward and Piotr, her face filled with quiet contentment. "I used to think families were just people who lived together," she said. "But now I know it's about love, and being there for each other no matter what." Edward reached over, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You've taught us as much as we've taught you, Anya. We're stronger together." As the fire crackled and the snow fell outside, the three of them sat in companionable silence, a family forged not by blood, but by resilience, trust, and love.